The banquet hall was flooded with warm lighting, polished champagne flutes, and chatter that echoed with money and legacy. David adjusted his collar and stepped inside, holding the invitation that still smelled faintly of old paper and fresh betrayal. After 3 years abroad, he had returned home early, against his professor's warnings, just to keep a promise. He hadn't told Mary he was coming. The welcome back party had been organized by his former department. He expected a formal round of handshakes, maybe even an awkward smile from Mary. What he didn't expect was the golden chandelier light casting its spotlight on her as she descended the staircase in a silk ivory gown, her hand resting delicately on George's arm. The entire room seemed to inhale and freeze. David's feet stopped moving. The wineglass he was handed trembled slightly in his grip. George was speaking confidently now, nodding to guests, smiling with the air of someone who didn't know when to shut up. "Oh? That's David, isn't it?" one of the board members said behind his back. "The researcher who left for the West? Didn't he leave Mary hanging?" another replied in a hush. David blinked once, twice, still couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. George noticed him. He nudged Mary, whispered something in her ear. Mary hesitated, then walked forward with a tight-lipped smile. Her lipstick, cherry red, was freshly reapplied, but David remembered the soft rose she used to wear. "David," her voice was cordial, "you're back." Before he could answer, George stepped in and clapped him on the shoulder like they were old friends. "Look who decided to show up, the ghost of the past himself." Laughter rippled from a few nearby guests. The insult was subtle, but the smirk on George's face wasn't. David kept his posture straight. "George, it's been a while." Mary's eyes didn't meet his. She held onto George's arm. "Tig." Ate Charlie, like she was trying to steady herself, but not for him. "I wasn't aware the Liu Group's engagement party doubled as a research department's reunion," David said flatly. "Oh, we didn't want to make a big deal of it," George said, "but you know how news spreads." That's when David noticed it, the couple's ring on Mary's finger, platinum, with a central diamond that glinted beneath the chandeliers, not the simple silver band they had exchanged back in university. That one was long gone, clearly. "Congratulations," he said, forcing the words out. Mary tilted her head, finally looking at him, almost with pity. "It's been 3 years, David." 2.5, he corrected. George chuckled. "He's still keeping track. That's dedication." More laughter. Someone from the medical faculty tried to change the topic, but the silence had already grown sticky. David looked down once more at the ring. He remembered buying it in a snow-covered street in Boston, hands shaking, savings nearly gone, and now it sat on her finger like it had never belonged to someone else. Mary leaned closer to George, whispering just loud enough for David to hear, her lips barely moving. "He's just a researcher. He'll fade out soon enough." David stared at them, chest tightening, hands cold despite the room's heat. "Then I'll make sure you never shine again." David first met Mary when he was just a scholarship kid with a cracked phone and hand-me-down blazers, trying to make sense of private school politics. She was the girl everyone whispered about, the only daughter of the Liu Group chairman, the kind who arrived in black sedans with tinted windows and ballet flats worth more than his month's rent. But she wasn't cruel. If anything, Mary was soft-spoken, distant in a delicate way, like she lived in a bubble of silk and expectations. He never expected her to even remember his name. But she did. During an evening study session in the library's dim mezzanine, she tapped his shoulder and whispered, "You're in my calculus class, right? You always solve the integrals before the teacher's done explaining." He laughed. "That's only because I've solved them the night before." That was how it started. Gentle, slow, and impossible. They grew close in secret. Mary's family had rules about image, legacy, social tiers. David didn't belong in their orbit. He knew it. She did too. But it didn't stop them from sharing sandwiches in the back stairwell, walking the long way home so they could brush hands beneath the streetlights. David fell in love with her the way he studied, obsessively, completely, and without hesitation. Her father found out midway through university. He called David into his study, poured a drink he never offered, and said, "If you really care about my daughter, prove you can be of value. Go abroad, get your name published. I'll consider you again once you've become someone." Mary cried that night. Her fingers clutched his blazer like it was the only thing anchoring her to the ground. "Will you still love me from that far away?" David cupped her cheek and smiled. "I'd cross oceans for you." And he did. The offer came a month later, a full research scholarship to a biomedical program affiliated with MO Medical Center. Prestigious, grueling, and based in a place where winter came early and stayed long. David packed 2 suitcases and left with just enough money to survive until the first grant landed. At first, the distance didn't seem to matter. Mary called daily, sent voice notes, snapped photos of their old classroom with captions like, "Feels empty without you." Her messages became the reason he stayed up late in the lab, fingers numb over cold metal, recalibrating equipment long past midnight. In return, he sent her research summaries. His first findings, gene therapy protocols that had potential in spinal recovery, were sent directly to Mr. Liu. It was Mary's idea. If Dad sees your value now, he won't just approve of you, he'll trust you. And so, David worked. Through flu seasons, snowstorms, and coffee rationing. He shared confidential frameworks and early patent drafts, all under the promise of a future. Every message ended with, "When you come back, I'll be yours forever." But gradually, those messages slowed. Her voice notes were shorter, sometimes they didn't come at all. David blamed time zones, then her workload, then his own overthinking. Until one day, she sent a photo. It was a back view of a man standing in a bookstore, holding a copy of Neuromancer. David blinked at it. The posture, the hair, even the way the man carried his satchel, everything screamed him. Mary captioned it. "I thought it was you. I miss you." David smiled, half flattered, half unnerved. He messaged back, "You called him by accident?" She replied, "Yeah, poor guy was so confused." A strange pang stirred in his chest. That was when Sarah entered his life, quiet, clever, always carrying a notebook too large for her bag. She was his junior in the program, assigned to help with data collection. Their first few interactions were purely academic, graphs, test tubes, hypotheses. But one evening, after David had collapsed during a late-night simulation, Sarah stayed by his side without a word, wrapped a lab coat around his shoulders and whispered, "Stop trying to burn yourself into someone else's definition of worthy." He never forgot that. Sarah never asked about Mary. She didn't need to. Her presence said, "You don't have to pretend here." But David still clung to the past. He kept sending results to Mr. Liu. The Liu Group, once stagnant, began releasing innovations that shocked the market. News headlines credited them for breakthroughs in recovery treatment and neural repair. Meanwhile, David's name remained buried behind NDAs and confidential funding agreements. He didn't mind, not then. He just wanted to come home, to her. So, he completed his 3-year doctoral course in 2.5. When he sent Mary the final message, "I'm flying home next week, I've reserved a ring," she replied, "Welcome back." Just that, no exclamation, no emoji, no "I love you." Still, David smiled at his phone like a fool, clutching the velvet box inside his coat. He had given her the foundation for her family's empire, and now, he was going to propose. The welcome back banquet was held in a luxury ballroom draped in ivory linens, towering centerpieces, and the kind of floral arrangements that reeked of polite money. David stepped in quietly, dressed in a tailored black suit, foreign cut, sharp but not showy. Someone at the entrance handed him a glass of wine and gestured him toward the main floor, where warm lighting met murmuring voices. It was supposed to be his celebration. A welcome for the golden boy who had left everything behind to chase prestige and return with results that had quietly changed the Liu Group's fate. Except no one seemed to notice him. He scanned the room. Colleagues, former professors, business partners of the Liu Group. Yet not a single soul approached to greet him. Not even the board members who used to praise his early prototypes like gospel. They barely acknowledged his presence now, more interested in whispering to one another, eyes darting toward the grand staircase. Then the music shifted. Everyone turned to look. David followed their gaze and saw her, Mary, draped in pale silver, hair curled and perfectly pinned behind one ear, a string of pearls hugging her collarbone. Her lips were red, not soft rose, not coral, red, a bold, attention-commanding shade she never wore before. Her hand rested on someone's arm. George. He was wearing the exact same navy suit David had left behind 3 years ago, minus the taste and minus the humility. His smile was wide, fake, and far too confident for a man who used to flinch during lab presentations. They descended together, their fingers interlaced. Mary leaned into him like it was second nature. The wine in David's hand tilted slightly, his grip tightened on the glass, knuckles white. People around him began whispering. "Isn't that Mary's new fiancé?" "That's George, he's in pharmaceuticals now, came up quick, real quick." "And David? What's he even doing here?" He moved to the side table, placing the untouched wine down before it slipped from his fingers. "David," a familiar voice greeted him. He turned. It was Professor Lin, one of his former mentors. "You're back," the man said, tone forced. "Welcome back. You must be surprised. About Mary." David didn't answer. Professor Lin offered a brittle laugh. "Well, you know how these things go. Life waits for no one." At that moment, Mary and George reached the center of the room. Someone handed them microphones. A toast was announced. "Congratulations to the Liu Group's future son-in-law," the MC boomed. "A man of medicine and business." George raised his glass. Mary smiled softly. No one mentioned David. He stayed at the edge of the room, shoulders still, eyes locked on the woman who had once promised to wait. And then George saw him. He nudged Mary, whispering something that made her glance over for a split second before quickly looking away. George chuckled. "David," he called out loudly, so the table nearby could hear. "It's like looking in a mirror. Am I your substitute, or is she mine?" A ripple of laughter. Mary didn't respond. David didn't smile. George raised his glass again. "Well, either way, we owe you one. Without your research, I'd never have found my way into this family." David walked away. He didn't trust his voice. He found the restroom, closed the door behind him, took a moment to breathe. That's when he heard it, muffled laughter, a whisper, then the soft thud of bodies against a mirror. The other stall door creaked. He stepped forward. On the countertop, lipstick, the same bold red now smudged on the edge of a tissue. Two handprints pressed against the mirror, one large, one small. The scent of perfume and sweat still hung in the air. The restroom door opened again. George stepped in, then froze when he saw David. "Ah," George cleared his throat. It wasn't what it looks like." David stared at him. George rubbed the back of his neck. "She just forgot her lipstick, that's all." David didn't reply, just moved to the side so George could pass. He didn't look back. Returning to the hall, he sat at the end of the banquet table, where the noise felt a little more distant. Mary was back beside George, laughing at something shallow and performative. Her lipstick was freshly reapplied, her eyes never sought him out. David picked up his chopsticks, then set them back down. Across the table, one of Mary's friends leaned over and giggled. "Honestly, George treats her like a queen. He even peeled her crab for her, not like someone who runs away overseas and leaves her all alone." Another whispered, "And he still expects loyalty? That's so self-centered." Mary didn't say a word. She just kept her head down, quietly spooning soup into her bowl as if none of it involved her. David's voice finally broke the silence at his table. He spoke softly, words meant only for her. "Do you remember what I gave up for your father's approval? This is how you return it?" Mary didn't answer. She didn't even look up. The rain fell in fine, unrelenting sheets, soaking David's coat and tracing down the collar of his shirt like cold fingers. He sat on the park bench across from the Liu Group's high-rise, his phone dimly glowing in his hand. Water pooled at his shoes, but he didn't move. His thumb hovered over the screen, scrolling slowly through years of messages from Mary. "Wear a scarf, it's snowing in Boston. Tell me if the experiments go wrong, I won't be able to sleep. When you come back, I'll cook for you every day. I saw someone that looked like you today, my heart skipped." Each text was a knife now, a reminder of a version of her that no longer existed, or maybe never had. David blinked slowly as a drop of rain slipped into his eye. He welcomed the sting. He opened an old voice note, her laughter from years ago echoed faintly through his earbuds. "You always solve things like they're math problems, but people aren't formulas, David. I like that about you." He paused the audio, stared blankly at the pavement. Somewhere beneath this downpour was the boy who once stood outside Mary's gated school, waiting with his backpack and 2 pieces of bread. The same boy she once surprised by jumping on his back, shouting, "Don't forget me when you're famous." Back then, she used to chase after him. Now she couldn't even meet his eyes. A notification lit up on his phone, a message from an unknown number. "Sarah. I heard what happened." Before he could respond, His phone rang. He answered with a low voice. Sarah. Her voice was soft, steady. You don't have to stay in the storm. He didn't answer. You're punishing yourself for something she did, she continued. You deserve better, David. Let go. He leaned back on the bench, watching the neon Liu Group logo flicker behind the foggy skyline. Letting go won't undo it. No, she said, but holding on is letting it eat you alive. The call ended quietly. 3 days later, David signed an employment contract with J-Tech, a rising competitor in biomedical research and Liu Group's most bitter threat. The irony wasn't lost on him. His own work had pushed Liu to the top, now he'd dismantle it from the inside. He kept his head low, no interviews, no media, just the lab, numbers, silence. He asked for the most unstable projects, the ones with the highest failure rates and the lowest patience. Within weeks, he had turned 3 failing prototypes into viable experiments. His manager was baffled. You're not working, you're dissecting vengeance. David smiled faintly. Same process, just more personal, but even vengeance had its interruptions. Late one evening, as he reviewed data over dinner at a rooftop lounge, the waitress arrived at his table with a bottle of wine. Compliments of the lady, she said, nodding toward the far side of the restaurant. David turned. Mary. She was alone, seated beneath the low glow of a lantern, dressed in black, her expression unreadable. He didn't wave, didn't nod, just stared. Eventually, she stood and walked over. May I? She asked, voice too calm. He said nothing. She took the seat across from him. Silence stretched long between them. The rain tapped gently against the glass wall nearby, forming beads that crawled down like tears on skin. I shouldn't have come, she said finally. He lifted his glass but didn't drink. Mary looked down at her hands. I wanted to say it wasn't how you think. I never planned to. Stop. David's voice was low, precise. You don't owe me a performance. Her fingers clenched the edge of the tablecloth. Do you really believe I never cared? I believe you cared about what I could give you, he said. My work, my loyalty, my silence. Mary's lip trembled slightly. You were gone. You don't know how lonely it was. He looked at her reflection in the half-full wine glass. The stem distorted her face, warped it slightly, like a mask slipping. No, he whispered to himself. What you loved was control. She blinked. What? He set the glass down and stood. Enjoy the wine, consider it a farewell gift. As he turned, she called out, David! He didn't stop. That night, back in his apartment, he wiped his whiteboard clean, erased every lingering note connected to Liu. He didn't need reminders anymore. This wasn't grief. This was planning. The boardroom erupted in claps and camera flashes as George stood at the podium, his tie slightly loose, one hand proudly wrapped around Mary's waist. She wore a fitted beige dress, her stomach slightly obscured by a silk shawl. There was no visible bump, but the press didn't care about facts, they cared about headlines. Mary and I are happy to announce, George said with a practiced grin, that we're expecting our first child. A murmur of approval and forced applause swept through the room. The announcement was coordinated. Strategic. It wasn't just a baby, it was a public relations bombshell designed to soften Mary's image and align George more closely with the Liu family. Headlines spread within hours, Liu Group heiress expecting. Scientific genius loses his muse. David watched the livestream in silence, alone in his office at J-Tech. He didn't blink, didn't even sip the coffee beside him. On the screen, George leaned into Mary and whispered something in her ear, causing her to laugh and nod. 3 hours later, Mary appeared in his office. She didn't knock. David didn't look up. You know how doors work. She stepped inside anyway, closing it gently behind her. You saw the press, she said, voice softer than usual. Didn't need to, the internet screamed it loud enough. Mary sat in the chair opposite him. George is proud. He wanted to make it public. David raised his eyes. You're not showing. It's early. He leaned back in his chair. So early you can drink wine last week, but now you're suddenly glowing. She hesitated, then leaned forward. David, I need you to keep quiet. About what? She lowered her voice. About us. About the meetings, the dinners. If anyone finds out we were together after I got engaged, it'll destroy everything. The company, the baby, my name. You mean your narrative, he cut in. The one where you're a victim of time, Nahis, out choice. She swallowed. Please, if you don't speak up, I'll make sure the Liu Group supports your research. You can come back into the fold, better funding, global exposure. David studied her. You're blackmailing me with promises you already broke. Mary reached into her purse and pulled out a pen drive. Then maybe this will help refresh your memory. She slid it across the table. He didn't touch it. She stood, exhaled sharply, and walked out. That night, David uploaded an audio recording to an anonymous account. No name, no context, just a voice, Mary's voice. Can we just talk again? You still matter to me. David, you know I never wanted this. I made a mistake, please. Can we get back together? By morning, the file had over 200,000 views. Conspiracy forums lit up. Some accused Mary of two-timing. Others speculated she was using the pregnancy to cover something deeper. Then George went live. Standing in a public park, his phone trembling in his hand, he shouted into the lens, "You all think I'm some fool, some stand-in for her ex? That recording, it's fake, she doesn't love him, I gave her everything." The phone slipped and the video ended with a jarring angle of George kicking a bench. Within hours, news outlets replayed the meltdown on loop, memes flooded in. Substitute George. Bench kicker dad. His reputation spiraled, Liu Group stock wavered. 2 days later, police entered David's office with a warrant. Mary had filed a report, corporate espionage, data theft, claiming David had used stolen intel from their prior meetings to sabotage Liu's projects via JTech. David didn't argue, he simply asked to see the footage. The officers complied. In the video, David was seen leaving a briefcase in the conference room to use the restroom. 30 seconds later, Mary entered, opened the briefcase, unlocked the laptop with a flash drive, copied data, and closed everything before stepping out again. The officers watched in silence. Looks like she forgot to delete the camera log, David said dryly. They left without further comment. That evening, he received a call from Sarah. You okay? She asked. Better than expected. There was a pause, then, let her fall, David, don't catch her this time. He looked out the window, city lights flickering below like shattered stars. She's not falling, he replied. She's being handed what she earned. They came for Mary and George at dawn, no knocking, no warning, just the sudden screech of brakes, the flash of blue lights, and officers flooding the Liu Group's penthouse suite like a dam breaking loose. George stumbled out of bed half-dressed, his voice cracked with sleep and panic. There's a mistake. What is this? Who sent you? Mary emerged from the hallway in a silk robe, mascara still smeared from the night before. Her voice was calm, rehearsed. We've done nothing wrong, our legal team will respond. The officers didn't respond, they simply handed over the warrant. Commercial fraud, data theft, intent to defraud investors through manipulated biotech claims. By 9 a.m., every media outlet from domestic tech blogs to global financial columns splashed the same breaking banner. Liu heiress and fiancé arrested in corporate espionage scandal. Screenshots circulated. A video of Mary being escorted into a black van with her head bowed. George shouting at reporters, blaming everyone but himself. Investors pulled out. Stock plummeted. And under it all, a single thread unraveled silently. David. He sat in his private office at Venus Biosolutions, the rival company he had helped Sarah restructure from the ground up. The same company that had once begged the Liu Group for licensing access. Now, it stood poised to replace them. Behind the headlines and the legal jargon was a simple truth. Every piece of data Mary had stolen, David had planted. He had known she'd come to him. He made it easy. Leaked just enough temptation in confidential-looking files, flawed formulas, dead-end code, expired trial licenses. Each one labeled carefully, convincingly. He let her think she had the upper hand. And she took the bait, over and over again. The moment she passed that data to her internal developers, Liu Group's core research began collapsing under false projections and reproducible IT issues. Panic set in. George rushed to cover the gaps with falsified reports. Investors backed away. Then the audits came. The collapse was timed down to the quarter. David leaned back in his chair, the blinds partially open, casting sharp lines across his desk. Sarah walked in quietly, a tablet in one hand, a mug in the other. "You saw the reports?" she asked. He nodded. She placed the coffee on his desk. "They're finished, and Venus is getting priority access to the National Health Database." He looked up. "Just like we planned." Sarah smiled faintly, but her voice was cautious. "You look tired." He exhaled. "I'm fine." She hesitated, then added, "George, he's sick." David paused. "What?" Sarah handed him the tablet. A leaked medical report. Stage 4 diagnosis, degenerative nerve disorder, no cure, less than 2 years. There was no malice in her tone, just information. David stared at the screen. Later that week, he visited the hospital. George was sitting on a bench outside, thin and sunken, a man stripped of his theatrics. He looked up as David approached and let out a bitter laugh. "Of course it's you," George said hoarsely. "You always win, don't you?" David sat beside him, silence stretching between them. "I'm dying," George said bluntly. "I know." George laughed again. "So, what? You come here to gloat?" David reached into his coat pocket and handed him a plain white card. "What's this?" "A contact. Someone at MO Medical Center. They can't fix it, but they can make the end less painful." George stared at the card, then at him. "Why are you helping me?" David stood. "Because one of us should walk out with some dignity." He left George speechless. 3 weeks later, David stood inside the visitation chamber of a correctional facility, staring through the reinforced glass at Mary. She looked different now, no makeup, her once long glossy hair was chopped to regulation length, her prison uniform hung off her like it didn't quite fit, her hands shook slightly as she lifted the receiver. "You came," she said. David picked up his side. "You always used to come when I needed you," she said, almost a whisper. He said nothing. Mary smiled, lips trembling. "I think about it all the time. If I had waited just a little longer, if I had trusted you instead of doubting." David tilted his head. "You didn't doubt me. You wanted shortcuts." Her smile cracked, her eyes were watery. "Was I really that disposable to you?" His face remained still. "You weren't disposable. You were a risk I won't take again." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, clutching something in her hand. Slowly, she lifted it, an old, tarnished silver ring. The couple's ring from high school, the one she once insisted on, the one he'd thrown into the rain months ago. "I kept it," she whispered. "It's all I have left." David didn't respond. He placed his receiver down, stood up, and turned away. Mary watched him walk to the exit, her lips parting, her voice caught in her throat. He didn't look back. That night, under grey clouds and soft drizzle, David walked along the city harbor. Sarah stood waiting beside the railing, umbrella in one hand, a thermal coffee cup in the other. He reached her without a word. She handed him the cup. They looked out over the water, still, dark, endless. She asked, "Do you regret it?" He sipped the coffee. "I regret who I trusted." Sarah didn't press further. As the rain tapped gently against the harbor tiles, David allowed himself to feel something again. Not grief, not victory, just the silence of peace. For once, there was no weight pressing down on him, only the open sky. The airport lounge hummed with quiet tension, pages turning, flight announcements echoing in the distance, and the low clink of coffee cups being returned to their saucers. David sat by the window, his coat folded neatly over his lap, suitcase beside his chair, passport wedged in the inner pocket. Sarah walked toward him from the coffee kiosk, 2 cups in hand. She wore a pale grey coat, the hem just brushing her knees, her hair tied loosely in the back, strands falling in soft arcs around her face. She handed him a cup without speaking and sat beside him. "You're really going?" she asked. He nodded, eyes fixed on the tarmac outside, where a jet taxied slowly toward the gate. "New continent, new project," she said, as if reminding herself. "You'll be building the lab from scratch. I like clean starts." She sipped her coffee. "You know I've been offered a transfer to Paris." He looked at her now. "Take it." She smiled faintly, then turned away. "You're a hard man to like, David." "I'm harder to wait for." Silence stretched. "I don't expect anything," she said softly, "but I'll say it anyway. I like you." He was quiet for a moment, fingers wrapped around the warmth of the cup. Then he said gently, "Not yet." She didn't argue. She just nodded once and whispered, "I'll wait." His boarding call came seconds later. They stood. She fixed the collar of his coat like she'd done a dozen times in the lab. He looked at her one last time, then turned and walked toward gate 17. But before that flight, there was one stop left. The prison air smelled like concrete and sterilized sadness. The same dull buzz of flickering lights, the same hollow footsteps echoing down linoleum floors. David stood across the reinforced glass, arms folded. Mary entered slowly. She looked nothing like the woman from his memories. Her cheeks were hollow, eyes sunken, hair cropped messily just above the ears. There was no polish left, no elegance, only a pale imitation of herself. She picked up the receiver with both hands, as if it was heavy. "You came," she said, her voice hoarse. He didn't sit, just watched her. Mary laughed dryly. "I must be really pathetic now." Still, he said nothing. She took a breath, bracing herself. "You ruined me for not waiting." His eyes didn't flinch. "You weren't punished for not waiting," he said quietly. "You were punished for what you did while I was gone." Mary blinked. A tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "I thought you'd forgive me eventually." "I did," he replied. That surprised her. "I forgave you the day I stopped needing to look back." He hung up the receiver. The sound of the plastic clack reverberated through the partition. Mary reached out toward the glass, but he was already walking away. She didn't call after him. She just sat there, alone. Hands trembling, eyes wide, mouth parted, but no sound. A year passed. Venus Biosolutions became the most recognized medical startup in Asia, bridging international partnerships and cutting-edge breakthroughs. David's name began appearing in journals. He lectured occasionally, declined interviews often, and spent most of his time in white rooms, surrounded by test tubes and ideas. One morning, he stood by the Atlantic coast, a suitcase in one hand, a folder full of research proposals under his arm. The wind tugged gently at his coat, the sea stretched before him, endless and cold. Sarah stepped beside him. Her hair was longer now, loosely tied with a silk ribbon. She didn't speak for a long time, just watched the waves crash softly against the shore. He exhaled, slow and full. "I used to think love was about holding on," he said. "And now?" "Now I think it's about knowing when to let go." She looked up at him. "Spring has arrived," she said. He smiled. Somewhere far away, behind locked walls and a sky that never cleared, Mary sat on a prison bench. Her hands clutched the frayed ends of a photo someone had once torn in two. Her eyes stared at nothing. Her lips murmured names that no longer answered. The world had moved on. But for Mary, winter never ended.